Devlog 1. Let's see how this goes. Started out this week doing some menu stuff. The first thing I did was I made it so that the player can input their name and it should save their name. After that, they either hit host or join and it should take them to the appropriate menu. On the lobby screen, you can see one or two players who have joined the lobby and the ready state. Once all players are ready, player 1 should be able to hit start and it would load them into the game. To do all this, I've been following a tutorial series on YouTube by Dapper Dino, who has a lot of great tutorials on multiplayer stuff. It's really helped me out. Now to test to see if it works. Once player 1 hits ready, then that means all players in the session are ready, and player 1 should be able to hit the start button. Only a couple of small errors to fix, it's not that big of a deal. Okay, attempt number 2. I think I fixed all the errors from before, so now when he readies up, it should be fine. That's better. After that headache, I decided to shift gears and work on something a little bit easier. I want to do something to make these menus a little bit less bland. They're temporary menus right now, but I still don't like looking at them. The first thing that I did was change the font. I think this font looks better overall for the game. Fits the aesthetic more. Next I grabbed a screenshot of the level we made and blurred it. I'll use this to replace the bland gray background. Then I added a parallax effect based on mouse movement. I think it adds a lot to an otherwise boring background. After that I changed the gradient colors for the buttons. I also changed the background image on the buttons to make them a little bit more normal. The menu's still not great, and it's definitely not the finished product. It's not so boring. Now back to the headache-inducing multiplayer stuff. The first player should be able to hit the host button and then see themselves show up in the lobby screen. If player 2 puts localhost into their join screen, then they should join the lobby that's the same IP address as the host. Then once both players ready up, the host should have the option to start the game. Then it loads both players into the new scene with their own instance and unique cards. Now that the foundation for multiplayer is finished, I think it's time to go and start fixing some bugs. There are a lot of bugs, and this is all just after one test session between my brother and I. The first thing that I changed was the character health bar. I fixed it so that the character's health displays red if they're at low health, and green if they're not. Then I had this annoying animation bug with the character's deaths, where they would die twice for some reason. After too long, I eventually figured out that it was because the animation had looping set to true. I turned that off, and now he dies normally. Next, I added some logic so that the character couldn't equip a new equipment piece if they were already using that piece. A golden rule of game development is protect the players from themselves. Next, I decided to add a little color variation to the cards. Obviously nothing here is final, but for now at least it helps you see different types of cards. Then it was time to focus on the character UI. I did a lot to change the stat screen overlay so it doesn't show up unnecessarily. There were several things to make sure of while doing so. I had to make sure it showed up when you were hovering over the player, and it disappeared when you weren't. I also had to make sure that you couldn't see two character UIs at the same time. Some adjustments needed to be made to the tooltip as well to fix the accuracy. I struggled for a while to work out the accuracy of everything and to get it working how I wanted. The last adjustment I made was making sure the character screen popped up whenever you were hovering over with an item. It's important that the player can see what stats they're going to be changing when they equip a new item. This will make it easier for them to determine if it's the right move or not. After this, I made some new UI elements to help display how much damage the character's taking. I'm not sure if I like them or not, but for now I'll keep it. The new UI element should show up whenever a character receives damage from any source, like when he is hit by another character for example. He takes X points of unblocked damage. The armor symbol shows up only if the character has armor to block with. They block damage equal to the armor that they have. Next it's time to address a problem that I have with ranged attacks. The pathfinding I made only accounts for melee attacks. It doesn't account for any ranged tiles that might be taken off. I changed it so that if you gave the character a ranged weapon, it would only display the path that you would need before you were in range of the target. But it turns out that none of this even mattered. You see, there was a problem if a character had a weapon that could be used as both ranged and melee. The game would have no way of knowing which attack the player wanted to do because it can't read their mind. In other words, if the character had a ranged weapon and the player wanted to do a melee attack, the game would have no way of knowing that. And it would calculate the path based on what it thinks the player wants to do. Eventually I plan to implement a system where a weapon can have two different uses, one from range and one from melee. So it's important that the player can be specific about what they want to do with their turn. My solution was to implement these little buttons here. This way, the player can tell the game beforehand what kind of move they want to make. That way the game doesn't have to figure it out. It'll make the game slower because it will require one more click per action, but I have plans to simplify it. Let's start with the inspect button. If you hover over any character, friend or foe, the inspect button will pop up. If you click it, it brings up that character UI screen I was working on before. This also effectively wiped out a lot of the work I did earlier, but that's how it goes sometimes. Different buttons show up depending on whether the character is selected or not, so I had to make sure I got the spacing between the buttons correct. Focusing on the move button now. If you select a character, it will give you the option to move them, as long as they have any stamina. After you click the move button, it will trigger the pathfinding system, which works the exact same way as I had it before. If you click a tile, your character should move toward that tile, or they'll move toward the closest tile they can reach, indicated by the path. I also added a stop button that shows up when you hover over the character. This just stops the character on whatever action they're performing. If you deselect the character by clicking on them, then it will also stop whatever action they're doing. Moving on to melee now, if you click on the melee button, a new pathfinding system is activated. This indicates every clickable tile adjacent to the character. Eventually I plan to add a click and drag system. That way instead of clicking all the buttons in order, you can just click the character and drag to a spot to move, or drag over a character to attack them, because leaving it this way can definitely get tedious. The ranged implementation was the trickiest. The new way of doing this was the only one that I didn't have the logic already in place for. When performing a ranged attack, a line appears that indicates where you're aiming. It extends only as far as the character can reach. If you click on a character that's in range, you should perform a ranged attack. And that's all for my first devlog. Thanks for bearing with me through this. It's my first time doing anything where I had to record myself, or edit in any way. I did my best to make it easy to follow along with and keep up, even if you don't know Unity that well. I hope you found it enjoyable, or interesting at least. And even more so, I hope you're into the game that we're making. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope we'll see you in the next one.